Now, without further delay, let's begin today's event, sponsored by Dimensional Insight and hosted by Health Data Management. I would like to introduce your moderator for today, and that is Fred Bozzoli. Fred, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on the impact of information governance on hospital revenue. We know that this is an important area for hospitals. There's increased interest in information governance, and facilities are beginning to look at the downstream effects of how that impacts revenue and how they supply funds to operate. We have two excellent presenters today. I'd like to introduce Bill Spooner. He's got nearly 40 years of healthcare experience. He recently retired after 18 years as the CIO of San Diego-based Sharp Healthcare, and he now serves as an advisor to healthcare systems and vendor firms on strategy, innovation, and performance improvement. And I am one of my best friends in the industry, and I'm excited to have him on this program. Also, Will Bryant, who's a contributor to HDM with insight and wisdom in terms of contributed articles and such. Will has over 20 years of experience in advanced analytics, enterprise information management, and data governance at a wide variety of healthcare organizations. And he's currently principal of Point B Management Consulting. And we're excited to have Will on this presentation as well. I'd like to begin by handing it off to Bill to give us a little bit of historical perspective about billing and how information governance fits into this. Bill?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. Usually when we're talking about information governance, or at least often, it's in a clinical context in terms of improving patient care, standardizing, reducing variation and such. Yet there's almost always a revenue driver behind it. And I think to understand that best, it's really important to understand how billing has evolved over the past several years and how this has emerged. If we go back to the days before Medicare, before many of us were involved in healthcare, it was basically a charge-based system. And a hospital printed a bill, various kinds of charges, and the patient or its payer submitted payment with a little bit of documentation, but it was pretty much charge-based. Medicare came along in the mid-1960s, which was a cost-based system, but the cost allocation was driven by charges, so it's still charges. The other thing, though, that Medicare funding brought along was the ability for hospitals to improve the care that they're providing, add more services, thus more charge items. It also fueled a lot of innovation, which brought technology to the field, and there became equipment charges, but still charges. By the early 70s, Medicare realized that costs were getting out of control almost, so it started looking at ways of limiting the increases that they were paying, and organizations became creative still around how they identified, managed their charges. There were restrictions like lower cost of charges and ratio of cost of charges, but essentially still charge-based. In 1983, Medicare introduced diagnostic-related groups, DRGs, and from there it has become more and more complex. And with the introduction of DRGs, all of a sudden coding became important with the ICD-9 codes, and suddenly organizations realized that they had to be concerned with documentation. At that era, it was really what was then called medical records abstractors, digging through documentation and picking out codes and going back to the physicians to clarify codes and ensure that they were complete. And sometimes even in terms of revenue maximization, I call it creative coding, because sometimes out of exuberance, optimism, sometimes coding became more aggressive than it needed to be, and by the early 90s there were efforts from the federal government to curb that. And then came the anti-fraud and abuse laws and so forth, and organizations had to be more and more careful about how they coded to ensure coding accuracy, to ensure that they were getting paid the right amount of money for them. By end of the 90s, 1998, to err is human, recognizing patient safety issues, and suddenly this clinical driver came out about physicians doing CPOE and better documentation, and we became introduced to templates in our electronic records and all sorts of structure, and we're really trying to get this to improve the structure. And as we go along through this continuum, coding becomes more and more important, and it becomes more and more important that organizations started looking at standard data elements, standard processes, everyone recording the same element in the same field in the computer so it was easily extracted. And this really evolved to what we have today when ICD-10 came into being about 5 years ago. Many organizations in preparations jumped in and did documentation improvement efforts to even more fully ensure that the doctors were documenting consistently and thoroughly to ensure that we were prepared for the extra detail that was going to be required for ICD-10. So then jumping on to today's situation, I'll hand it off to Will. I missed a slide, but you can see this slide for just a second, and then I'll hand it off to Will to talk more specifically about what's happening right now in terms of cash flows, margins, reimbursements, et cetera.
And Will,
Will, are you there?
Yeah, so I wanted to thanks for the handoff there, Bill. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. I think one of the things we want to do is just flip it around a little bit. Bill did a great job on kind of the development of it, but really the current environment is extremely challenging for all of the developments that he outlined, and all of those call for more efficiency. And in this case, efficiency in most cases turns into some form of governance. So if you look at the differing issues that have to be addressed around patient eligibility, the claims documentation, medical coding, denials and underpayment, proof of compliance, and the regulatory risk management, those are the increasing demands in those areas are requiring more and more coordination across functional areas and sharing information and having a way to really look forward to change, because the things that Bill was mentioning, right, the pace of change is increasing, and the requirements from both regulatory and allowable coding, all those sorts of things are changing more and more rapidly. So one of the things that hospitals need to do is really build a competency around that coordination across functions, but also just being able to manage the rate of change to stay ahead of the game and not be really adversely impacted by a lot of the greater complexities in the system within the Affordable Care Act and other forms of regulation and compliance requirements in there. So what I wanted to do is go on for just a second here and talk for a moment about just what we mean by the information governance. So there's a definition here, and everybody can read it faster than I can read it to you. But really the idea is that the information governance is an organizational capability, right, that is around those processes, standards, and the roles necessary to manage and coordinate the information. And if you think about that, that can be huge, right? As Bill mentioned, originally the heavy emphasis was in clinical. Now it's growing. But what we're looking about is really within the revenue cycle. And even within the revenue cycle, there are the types of information that need governance are are typically pretty specific, and you start small on it, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. But the things that need to be governed are the things that will impact the enterprise from a full revenue cycle standpoint. So there'll always be lots of information in specific systems and in specific functions and processes that need to be managed, but don't necessarily rise to the level of needing organization-wide information governance. So we'll talk some more about this as we go along. But before we do, we have a couple of polls that we'd like to take. Fred, would you like to lead those?
Sure, you bet. we would like to get kind of a temperature of the of you as attendees in terms of where you are as an organization in the adoption of data governance. First question is, has your organization adopted an enterprise-wide data governance capacity? And I'll give you about 15 or 20 seconds to click on one of those buttons and hit the submit. We'll have 3 questions in a row here, and then we'll discuss the answers a little further downstream. Okay, about 5 more seconds. Okay, on to the next question. If your organization has not yet adopted an enterprise-wide data governance capability, which of the following are the reasons why? In about 30 seconds to click on your answer or answers. Okay, and let's move on to the last of our polling questions. What were the primary drivers for adoption of an enterprise-wide data governance capability if your organization is moving in that direction? Which of those 5 options? Okay, about 5 more seconds. Great. Thank you. That will help us with some of our discussion going forward. Bill, I believe you're next up here.
Thank you, Fred. On that second polling question, you may have been looking for another answer that's not listed there, which is it's darn hard work, and it takes a lot of time. And I'm going to present 3 examples here, 3 different scenarios, different organizations that I'm familiar with, and just describe information governance processes, attempts within those organizations. The first one is a small multi-hospital system. They, like many of the multis, have grown by absorbing neighboring hospitals in the community, bringing the various hospitals onto a common IT platform, but initially doing it with a lot of flexibility in terms of configuration across the hospitals, and then recognizing that, gee, we can do a better job of billing. We probably would have a much more efficient collection process if we could standardize some of our terms. And some simple things like patient types, for example. Many of these things drive billing differently. So this organization came together, and it had good support by senior leadership with CFO, Chief Nursing Officer, CMIO, all sorts of operational leadership together in a room who just simply said, you know, we don't have a burning cross here, but we have the knowledge that it's the right thing to do. And essentially, we think we need to do it. So this was organized into biweekly meetings. They focused on specific data tables. Let's not try to do everything at once, but let's look at what we think are the most visible and the most impactful elements that will really affect both billing and to some extent analytics. And let's define the data, let's document it, and then agree that we go forward with it. Very collaborative effort, very well engaged, and I would rate that as a good effort, very positive, maintaining continuing support, and slow and steady. It's not something that can be accomplished overnight, but good work by everyone. My second example is a little bit out of the normal view that you would consider information governance, but I thought this would be a good example, a good positive example. And this was in the time when organizations were getting ready to make the move to ICD-10 coding a few years ago, 5 years ago. There was a real recognition that even with ICD-10, which was a lot simpler, that we had incomplete documentation, inconsistent documentation. We probably were losing revenue even with that simpler model. And the organization really decided that was important. They brought together some data. They used a vendor tool to identify potential reimbursement gains if they improved their documentation. A very respected CFO, and when I say respected, I mean all across the organization, including by medical staff leadership, that they needed to do that. And so they organized with all of the necessary players, physician, operational, IT, very clearly chaired by this CFO. It took more than a year to go through the first wave of it, to achieve agreement, to improve documentation. At the end of the process, they were able to see, and I would say the most tangible indicator would be improved case mix index, significantly improved case mix index on their Medicare patients, which naturally results in increased reimbursement. So there was very much a financial driver behind it, although it was better documentation, and the increased reimbursement was reimbursement that the organization truly had coming to it simply by improving their documentation, standardized data elements, standardized documentation processes, and so forth. My third example is more of a long-term. This would be similar to the first example, but with less, maybe less immediate need or perceived need to do it. Again, a multi-hospital organization. Really, the impetus came out of the analytics process around value-based purchasing. We need to be able to report the outcomes indicators, for example, consistently, thoroughly, in order to ensure that we get the performance incentives that we believe we're entitled to. This was an effort that was really established out of the IT organization with other key players around the organization, all the same examples that we had from the previous examples, but more of an IT-led initiative. This organization actually purchased one of the popular master data management tools so that it could really thoroughly document the databases as they were emerging. There was a person formally charged with the title of Director of Information Governance. And again, slow but steady process, clearly recognition within the organization that it's the right thing to do, yet still less perception of the value, except perhaps once or twice a year when they can identify that they get larger performance bonuses than they might have otherwise. So a really long and steady process with ebbs and flows, but really an IT-led initiative. So having given those three examples, let's hear what all of you had to say in terms of these polling questions about your experience with information governance. Back to Fred.
Hey, thank you, Bill. It looks like from our audience there's a little bit of few organizations that are moving in this direction, but looks like the vast majority are still in process. What do you guys take away from these polling results?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. That this is fairly typical. What we see in a lot of healthcare organizations is, as Bill mentioned, this is difficult work. And so there'll be pockets of excellence or advancement on it, or it'll be kind of case by case, right? There'll be a specific, revenue cycle issue, and, you'll kind of put together a SWAT team to address it and fix that, but it doesn't really rise to the level of organizational capability or kind of a repeatable process. So it's one of the things that a lot of organizations will sort of take a run at, but never actually, get it into a sustainable model. Bill, is there something you had to say on it?
And I think that, yes, let me just add to that. You're reading and seeing about a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening over the last several years around the country when two hospitals align or two hospital organizations align. It's, they have a timetable. They want to get things done. And usually the timetable is about half the amount of time that people really think it will take. And it's really tough to stop and say, oh, gee, now let's make sure that our charge masters are identical, that all of our coding specifications are identical. And organizations just recognize that, first of all, they have to complete these consolidations, and they just really determine that the best answer is to go back and clean it up later. I think that's just based upon the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and I'd say it's then, given the drive to do it, that's kind of the default, but obviously going back and cleaning it up after the fact is, difficult to do, right? It's one of those chores that kind of gets done intermittently or not at all. And the other part is that in addition to the mergers and acquisition side, really the bar keeps rising as well, right? That once some things are pretty well governed, you got good processes, and you're managing the data well, that sort of becomes unimportant, and now there's a new set of conditions like implementing ICD-10 or changes to Medicare reimbursement and keeping up with all of those, that there's the bar for success in managing that information is constantly increasing as well. So it's another challenge to get there.
And this is, do you feel like organizations, once they get into this, they really realize the immensity of the task before them, and does that have kind of an impact on how they move forward on this?
Yeah, I'd say one of the Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Undoubtedly, that's the case, and they realize that it's a large, commitment, and they recognize that they have limited resources, so they try to structure a project so that they can start making progress, but it's not something that they can put an entire effort over a period of 6 months and be done in most cases.
Yeah, I'd say that it's very easy to fall into sort of paralysis by analysis, right? It's just so immense that even figuring out where to start can be a major obstacle, right? That it just looks so daunting and so hard to even prioritize and pick out the areas to start, that can be a major obstacle. The feeling that to do this is going to require, a serious commitment to permanent full-time headcount and all of those kinds of things. So that's clearly a big obstacle to doing it. And I think we'll see some of that on the next one of the next polling questions as well.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at it then. If your organization has not adopted an enterprise-wide data governance capability, what are the reasons why? Resources limitations are at the top of that list. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'd say they fit in. Other is kind of big, so it'd be a little interesting if anybody has can share anything in the comments on what they had in mind with other. The resources are clearly huge. Obviously, the minimal ROI, right? People, generally people or organizations are pretty clear that there are some opportunities there. I mean, just given write-offs and the speed of reimbursement and all of those kinds of things, there's clearly an ROI, but limited resources is going to be a key one. Time to implement is kind of interesting there in that gets into the question of sort of where do you pick your battles, right? And looking at the cross of time to implement, the ROI, and the degree of difficulty all sort of play in together. And so one of the keys to really getting launched off is finding the right tasks to work on to manage both the resource commitment and the implementation time and associated costs. Bill, is there anything you had on that?
I think the question, the minimal ROI response is really probably not an incomplete recognition of the potential ROI attached to having cleaner data. We've talked for years about how it's better to ensure that everything is collected on the front end in terms of admitting information than waiting until people have to fix it in the billing office. And that's probably the best example. But I've seen a number of, I'm not going to call them studies, but reports that purport to show a more efficient, less costly billing operation if the organization is able to deploy fewer touches, in other words, less handling of the bill manually, and have those touches be up front rather than in the billing office after the patient has gone home. And those things are hard to document. A few organizations have done that, and I think that's something that occurs as organizations are looking for more efficient cash flow, more efficient operations around cash flow to improve revenue. But I think if you looked harder for the ROA, you'd probably find more than one would realize. The other category comes back to my early comment about it's darn hard work. I think everybody knows that.
Bill, do you feel that a lot of this maybe has to do with information governance being perceived as more slightly weighted as more of a clinical necessity and not so much of a having any financial benefit?
I think it's to the clinicians. It may be the other way around, Fred. I can't count the number of times that I've heard physicians comment that coding is a financial effort, a billing effort. We have to code like crazy in order to collect the money, and so it's a challenge to get clinicians to jump in and do that without a direct benefit to them. We try to sell it. We try to sell it as a clinical benefit, which it is, but it's also a financial benefit, and that seems to have been, in my experience, the one thing that the clinicians point to as they reluctantly engage.
Okay, interesting. Let's move on to the last polling question. What were the primary drivers for adoption of an enterprise-wide data governance capability? Pretty even results, but regulatory compliance and improving care quality are two of the bigger reasons why. What do you guys feel about that as common experience? Bill?
Yeah, I would say. Bill, do you want to go ahead?
I'd say that's pretty accurate today. I think that the top one, managing new payment models, will become more and more significant as value-based purchasing grows and more dollars become attached to the performance indicators. But today, I think that's an accurate depiction.
Yeah, I definitely agree that what we're seeing is the various reimbursement models have started to take hold but are increasing rapidly. And definitely the regulatory compliance is a thing that we've seen a lot of, that the amount of overhead that's being generated within the organization, just in terms of time and effort to meet those requirements, is really growing exponentially. And quite a few of the organizations, hospital systems that we've worked with are just trying to get that under control because it's just beginning to eat up so much time to do that just from a operational standpoint is not sustainable. So it's been a major issue.
Okay, well, very interesting results. Good to get a picture of where our audience is on these things. Let's move on. I'm not sure if this is Will or Bill at this point. They sound so much alike.
I think I'm up. I'm trying to find the slide, Bill.
Yeah, for the good information governance look like, I think, Bill, you had a number of things to say on that front first.
Okay. My screen is blank. Can everybody else see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it, Bill.
Okay, if you can see it, I'm fine. So this is my really unscientific set of requirements for what I would view as good information governance, and I'm sure that others can add or subtract from it. But very clearly off the top, good information governance is consistent definitions of data fields, data elements, and the business rules around it. What populates that element? I mean, that's very, very basic. And an agreement on recording the data in the same fields. And everybody has got examples in their clinical systems, especially where I've heard, oh, gee, there's 16 places where I can record the patient's temperature and things like that. Uniform recording in the field that we all agree upon. That constitutes good information governance. And then critical fields, some kind of validation process that in fact they are populated, whether they become required fields or what you put in required ranges to test the values that are going in. I would consider that to be good governance. Consistent definition and recording across multiple systems. Now that's less of an issue as we've gotten to the predominance of the enterprise vendors like Cerner and Epic, where many of the systems are all defined by the same set of tables. But even in that environment, you've got collateral systems like imaging packs, in some cases separate revenue cycle solutions and so forth, and you'd like to see consistent data definitions across those multiple systems. Somebody owning the particular tables and dictionaries. And so often somebody in IT may control all of them. I would prefer to see someone who actually is responsible for the function that those fields are supporting take ownership of them, and that there be a defined process for changing those tables and fields. If there is a need for adding the data element or changing a value in a field, there'd be some kind of a clearinghouse and a process for gaining agreement that that change will be done. So there would be and I'm really bridging a little bit into the analytics side, but a well-communicated and a well-documented process for retrieval from the system so that we really understand the data that's coming out of those fields and we're interpreting it properly. In an ideal setting, a good tool set, maybe this is a commercial for George, I'm not sure, but a good tool set for organizing and documenting the content, establishing the ownership, establishing and documenting the rules around all of the databases. Number one, though, I think, is the governance organization around it, strong leadership support. And there's always the question of who should own it. In my view, I list on the slide clinical, finance, and IT. I think quite often the IT department ends up owning it. I'd rather see someone in operations own governance so that they really understand and so they really are communicating to the organization that it's the importance of them in terms of the business and patient care. That's obviously a long discussion item. And then in order to get there, and I may be a little bit duplicate from a later conversation, but how do you get it started? Clearly it's not something that you can go through and accomplish across the entire organization at once. Find a pressing issue. I call it walk before you run. Find a pressing issue and prove the value so that you can show the organization that it's important. And moving along, let me see if my slides have caught up to me. So despite how hard it is, and I keep emphasizing that this is not an easy task, it's still important. And I'm focusing, right on revenue. We've gone from era when the biggest focus on capturing all our revenue, was looking for lost charges, making sure that all the revenue is recorded in the system. That's still important. But today we want to make sure that all of the clinical codes are in the system to ensure that we're being paid the proper amount. Don't forget about the charges, but you also have to ensure that the codes are in. We've also gone from an era of simply collecting the receivables to get the days in accounts receivable down to maximizing the revenue, to ensure that we're getting paid the optimal amount, the correct amount for the services that we are rendering. So that takes an entirely different view of revenue. In some organizations, will monitor the percent of revenue collected. And so that's really direct impact upon the bottom line. We are moving to the era of value-based purchasing. Some organizations are going faster than others, and those value-based programs frequently involve recording of different outcomes indicators, and we're starting to see those outcome indicators driving a piece of the payment. So the more that happens, the more important that a strong, consistent database and good information governance will be. There was an article published in New England Journal of Medicine just in the last couple of days where the author said you can no longer complain about having a foot in two canoes. In other words, a foot in charge-based and a foot in value-based purchasing. You're going to have to move to value-based purchasing. That's the way of the world. A really good recent case in point in terms of effective documentation has been the announcements just in the past few months by two of the payers, at least, Anthem and United Healthcare, about containing their payments in the emergency room. In Anthem's case, restricting on visit necessity. Was this really required to be an emergency room visit before they're willing to pay for it? That's kind of their fundamental principle. Or United Healthcare saying we're going to review every level 4 and every level 5 service based upon our computer model to determine whether in effect this should have been a level 4 or level 5. Both very strong efforts on the part of the payer to ensure that they're only paying for what they should be for emergency room care, thus requiring us on the provider side to ensure that we have accurate documentation, in other words, underlying the need for strong information governance. Back to Will.
Great. Yeah, I think those are really relevant points. And one of the things, going back to the polling question of, how many people, how many organizations and people on the call are underway with this process, the hardest part is really going from those sort of one-off activities to building a real sustainable organization capability around information governance. And so I'd say one of the biggest changes I've seen, like over the past when we're doing this, is our projects have sort of aligned these a lot closer. So it's what can we do to get significant value and build a capability, but have real ROI measurable results in a relatively short time frame. And that differs from the sort of SWAT team model in that it really is looking at a capability. So it's not just building to solve one problem and then disbanding and forming another team. It's like, how can you build capacity to start growing and scaling this up to tackle larger scale or more difficult or more complex governance issues around the revenue cycle? And it really comes down to a number of pretty simple guidelines, right? One is just being very pragmatic, starting small, learning by doing, not over-engineering. As Bill was mentioning, if you think of like all of the potential systems that you have and all of the attributes and issues and things like that, rapidly it can grow, and then it no longer is a couple of month project to get that ROI. It's grown into a multi-year huge project. So it's really being able to do that triage even around the information governance to really keep a strong focus on let's do something, let's get some results, let's prove out the processes, and the governance system that you're putting together, and then build on that. And then none of these things are really carved in stone. That lots of other organizations have done that. There are great models to start with that you can tweak and adjust as you go along. So it's those kinds of things. And then the other thing is, even if it's not a huge project that you're chasing after, try and pick something that really is cross-functional, because that's where the degree of difficulty comes into it for most organizations, right? That things that are focused just within admissions or on the clinical side or billing, those are easier to do from an information governance, and they're not really organization-wide, they're not really enterprise level, where the capability and the larger benefits come in is when you have something that's cross-functional. Even if it's a relatively narrow problem, having something that really builds that muscle memory or that capability is great. And that you want something lasting, right? That once you have it in place, you put in tools to you prove it out, test the hypothesis, say, okay, yes, we can fix this, and then actually start making process changes, start changing job descriptions, start changing incentives, put in automation as needed, layer in additional tools and monitoring and those kinds of things, so that what you're building is not just, okay, we had a massive effort to go in and clean up data, and we're done, and then the data starts decaying again. So it's really building some capability there around it. The other thing I noticed, the majority of our clients really focus on write-offs. One, it's the kind of thing where once something's been written off, it's gone forever. So there's, it's not like improving your recovery rate from a coding standpoint where you can kind of come back. And it provides a benefit that recurs. So if you find a way to decrease your write-offs by $10 or $15 million a year, that's something that you get, year in and year out. So those have been the kinds of things that our clients have focused on. To be even a little more specific, a lot of times what we found to be effective on the revenue recognition side is kind of look at a particular revenue cycle and go through the life cycle of it, and really just have a workshop among the key participants across the function to identify where where's the leakage or loss in that revenue cycle and the pain points, because having some of the key people in the room is a very quick way to identify cross-functional opportunities that then can feed into this process. And so we've done quite a few things around kind of life cycle workshops and things like that to really get a jump start on it, rather than having it be a month or two of analysis, to get a short list very quickly on the order of days as opposed to weeks or months, to have some hypotheses that can be tested and worked on from an information and governance standpoint. That was all I had to say on that. I'll hand it back over to Fred.
All right. Thank you, guys. Those are incredibly useful insights in terms of being real world and actionable. I'd like to bring it over to George Deely. He's the Vice President of Healthcare Solutions for Dimensional Insight. They're sponsoring this webinar right now, and they have a special interest in this as an area of interest in terms of information governance. So, George, you want to take it from here and tell us what's up?
Thank you very much, Fred, and thanks, Bill and Will, for a very thought-provoking discussion. So I'm George Deely. I lead the team that designs, develops, and supports Dimensional Insight's healthcare analytics solution product line. And this discussion, what Bill and Will described, very much resonates with how we're thinking about governance, particularly as it relates to analytics. So I wanted to share a few observations from the work that we've done with our own customers around the evolving convergence of governance, analytics, and collaboration. Historically, the focus of the analytics initiatives has been on integrating and transforming raw data from various transactional systems into information that's ultimately useful to decision makers, both on the front lines and the back offices. But how well that information actually supports decision making depends pretty heavily on governance. So it's pretty difficult to get analytics right without incorporating governance and including stakeholders in the process of defining and then continually evolving information, much as Bill described. You can look at the analytics process as a continuous loop of information refinement and knowledge creation. And in particular, as information consumers, over there on the right-hand side of this slide, use what's been defined by stakeholders, they develop new insights that can contribute to the process of refining information, provided those insights can be captured and incorporated into the data, which often they can, both through the data and metadata amendments to it. So that's one opportunity. Another opportunity is to streamline the overall process of knowledge harvesting to make it more efficient and responsive to evolving requirements. So the traditional process of developing systems tends to be IT heavy. The challenge there is that it relies on scarce resources, that being IT, and that also much can be lost in translation between the subject matter experts and the stakeholders who have the needs and the developers who implement the systems that actually get used. We refer to that phenomena as friction, and it also applies to the dynamic between stakeholders and information consumers. So a more ideal approach, and this came out in the conversation a little bit earlier, would be to provide stakeholders and subject matter experts with opportunities to play a more active and direct role in defining and in maybe even creating the systems that deliver the information. Much of that process can be streamlined through technology and automation at this point. And the potential advantages are quicker implementation cycles, more meaningful information, and better communication and continuity among stakeholders, subject matter experts, and information consumers. Because ultimately, the goal is to create systems and assemble information that makes it more intuitive and is as straightforward as possible to confidently answer the important questions like how should we segment our populations, where's the variation in practice patterns and what's the impact that it's having, and what will be the impact of risk and quality-based contracts as we begin to move into them. So we're using these concepts as guidelines and guideposts as we develop our own analytics solutions. So if you're interested in these topics, particularly the convergence of analytics, governance, and collaboration, we'd invite you to download this white paper by Jennifer Bresnick of Healthcare IT Analytics that discusses some of the trends I described and also to explore the actual experiences of Dimensional Insight customers in the case studies section of our website, which you can see here. So thanks very much for attending, and back to Fred.
Right. Thank you, George. We do have some time for question and answer. If you have any questions that you would have for us to address, this would be the time to submit them. I do have a few that have come in, and we'll start out with those. Will and Bill, how do we get started on this? What's the kickoff point, or what's the impetus for getting this underway, this kind of information governance initiative?
I think that Will did a nice job of describing it, get started in the one slide that he presented a minute ago. But as I think of it in a couple of focal points, one is find a burning issue, something that is really critical to the organization so that the organization really is committed to attacking it. And then once you've been successful with that, the organization will more likely see the value in continuing. And I think secondly is to find a leader with a passion to really tackle the project. I think those are just two essential elements to really getting the project underway and making some quick early progress and achieving some early wins.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Bill. The way we look at, we have sort of a quick start methodology that we use quite a bit with Point B. And that's, as you said, it starts off really with having a key stakeholder. And as I think we've talked about so far this morning, is really going through what where the ownership lies. And although a lot of times these are IT driven, to really be effective, it often makes sense to have it come from the business side or from operations to really have a sponsor, because a lot of the things that need to be done are going to be kind of critical business decisions that IT is really not necessarily in a position to drive or escalate on, or there are going to be process changes to the organization to support these things. So it really makes sense to have IT in more of a supporting role in that. But what we like to do is say, well, you need to assemble a working group of stakeholders, right? It won't necessarily be your full steering committee or an organization, but really who are the key stakeholders who could potentially transition into those roles, and then look at what the kind of the drivers are, where are the big opportunities, and then drill down very quickly, as Bill was saying, into something actionable. And it's generally a trade-off between picking something that's large and important, but also picking something that's achievable to get some results there. Sometimes if you get overly ambitious in your selection or your choice of starting item, you can bite off something that's just so big and organizationally or politically difficult to implement that it sort of stalls out and doesn't get resolved. So it's picking a combination of something that's does have sponsorship, has a clear ROI and business importance, but is also something that's manageable to get some results and build that virtuous cycle.
Anytime you have organizational change or try to gain momentum for an effort like this, it often takes some wisdom about how to proceed in an organization. What's the best way to gain organizational support for something like this?
Well, Brett, I'll come back to my earlier comment. You've got to find a burning issue, something that's impactful. Are you trying to solve a problem? Maybe you've recognized some revenue loss. Maybe you've had a compliance issue. So you've got a real burning issue that has to be tackled. It has to be tackled quickly, and it has to be a sustainable correction.
Yeah, and I'd say the other portion of it is having the right mechanism, because the hardest ones of these to solve are always ones where the benefit happens farther down the line in billing or collections or things like that, but the burden is upstream, like on admissions or on the clinical side or something like that, right? So basically, you're in a position of saying, well, admissions is going to have to invest more in training or reduce turnover or something like that, and it'll have a clear benefit downstream and really material impact in terms of ROI, hard dollar ROI, but really having the organization in place, and that's what really turns it into governance, right, is being able to get people into the room, but having the right sponsorship and the right level of organization to keep people in an enterprise perspective, and that these are that people have to be out of their silos and thinking about the benefit to the organization overall, and making sure that you've got the driver, to Bill's point, of here's the opportunity and here's what we all need to do to realize that opportunity.
Here's a question. Right now, I'm the only person in my organization who sees this as an essential movement. How do I find like-minded individuals. Sounds like the person needs a dating app or something, but how do you find people that will come alongside you and begin to take this as a cause?
Well, one way that we've seen to do that, and it's traditionally difficult to kind of start in the middle, right? I understand the pain behind the question there. A lot of times it's really looking more at a business benefit, kind of to Bill's point as well, right? Is there something that if you look at it from a business issue, a business problem, that the solution is truly cross-organization revenue cycle information governance, then, who are the impacted stakeholders in that, and start building into what it is that, get that group together, but really focus on the problem as opposed to the specific mechanism necessarily. That's sort of like, okay, well, here's, we all agree on the problem, and then start introducing the process. Like we've had clients who were, completely allergic to any word of governance or anything like that because they saw it as very bureaucratic or kind of a control issue, and they've had bad experiences with it. So, you can come in kind of softly around it and say, well, it's information management, or it's, data quality improvement or something like that, as opposed to saying governance, and kind of edge into it in that direction, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, I see we're at the top of the hour. I think it's time to say thank you to Will and Bill for their presentations today, and thank you to George and Dimensional Insight for sponsoring this discussion. We hope it's been helpful. I think a lot of good groundwork here in terms of information that you can use to get information governance kick-started and rolling in your organizations. So with that, we thank you at Health Data Management for listening in today, and we wish you a good rest of your day and a good Easter weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us today. This does conclude today's conference. You may now disconnect.